Hi, Dr. Dolly. I have a question about commodities. So, the general sense that I've gotten from people like yourself, Paul Merriman, Bernstein, has been that commodities are too volatile and don't have a good enough return to really consider them as a significant portion of your portfolio, and that perhaps at most, you could put a couple of percent in precious metals as a hedge against inflation, and because, the Bernstein mentions that you will end up buying low and selling high more as you rebalance because it's so volatile. But it's pretty much limited to that from my understanding. However, I'm reading a book called Asset Allocation by Roger Gibson, and he actually talks about using it perhaps a bit more because of its typically negative correlation with US stocks, and that can, as a part of an integrated portfolio, end up giving you better returns with less volatility. For example, he has a model of portfolios between 1 and 4 asset classes, the asset classes being US stocks, non US stocks, real estate, and commodities in equal allocations. And interestingly, the 4 with the best Sharpe ratios are the 3 and 4 asset class portfolios that include commodities, even though commodities themselves have the most volatility and the smallest return. So, my question here is, why haven't I really heard anyone else talk too much about commodities in the circle of people that I respect on the matter of investing, such as yourself? Is, Mr. Gibson's data simply too limited? His data is from 1972 to 2011, so I don't know if maybe there's just not enough historical perspective, or is there some other reason that I'm missing as to why you wouldn't put perhaps more than just a couple percent of your portfolio into commodities? Anything that you could tell me would be greatly appreciated, and if you would recommend potentially putting a portion into commodities, if you could say kind of what constraints on the percentage of allocation of your equity portfolio you would put into that, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, so this is a good question. There are books and authors out there that talk about including commodities in a portfolio. And this is perhaps why asset allocation is so personal, right? You go out and read some books, you read some blog posts, you figure out what you agree with, what you don't agree with, and you pick something reasonable and you stick with it for the long term. Right? So if it feels to you that having a few percent of your portfolio in commodities is reasonable to you, if you're convinced by the arguments of Roger Gibson and asset allocation that this is a wise thing to do with your portfolio, then that's okay with me. Put a little bit of money into commodities, rebalance it each year, and eventually commodities will do really well. They'll do better than stocks and bonds and gold and real estate and whatever for a year or two. And then they'll go back to underperforming. It's a little bit like gold that way. Yes, it's a way you can hedge your portfolio. Do I own commodities? No. I don't own commodities in my portfolio. I don't find the case for them particularly strong. Larry Swedroe was one who really pushed for commodities, in this case, collateralized commodity futures as part of a portfolio for years and years and years, and it really didn't turn out to do very well at all. So why are you not hearing about commodities right now? Well, chances are you're not hearing about it because they haven't done well in quite a while. And even smart people that talk about, investing on forums and who get on blogs and stuff, they chase performance as well. And so when something hasn't done well in a long time, do they talk about it? No. So commodities haven't done well for a long time. Nobody's talking about them. Bitcoin's done really well recently, so everybody's talking about Bitcoin. But you know what? When Bitcoin does poorly, everybody stops talking about Bitcoin and starts talking about commodities. And so you got to be careful not to performance chase. You got to pick a percentage that you can stick with for the long term. In my case, for commodities, that's 0%. Okay. In your case, it might be 5%, and that's fine. But whatever you can stick with long term, you rebalance it once a year, and eventually, when that asset class is in favor, it will provide the benefit to the overall portfolio that you're hoping for. But a little bit like precious metals, I expect commodities to mostly, over the long term, keep up with inflation, but with pretty significant volatility that you got to put up with. I track a commodities index on my monthly market report in the newsletter. If you subscribe to the newsletter, and you should, it's totally free, right? It's got lots of good stuff in there, including this monthly market report. But I've always been impressed with how volatile commodities are and how poor the returns can be for quite lengthy periods of time. And it's just not an asset class I find particularly attractive. Number two, every asset class you add makes your portfolio more complex, right? I've already got 8 in my portfolio. How many asset classes do you want in your portfolio? And if you only want 5 or 6, are you really going to burn one of those on commodities? I probably wouldn't. So what percentage is reasonable? Again, I'd say a single-digit percentage. But the way I kind of feel about it is if I'm not willing to put at least 5% of something into a portfolio, it probably doesn't belong in there at all, right? If you don't believe strongly enough in gold or Bitcoin or commodities or whatever to put 5% of your portfolio into it, what are you doing? You're just playing with it. Putting 0.5% into your portfolio statistically is not going to move anything. There's no point. You're just introducing unnecessary complexity and giving yourself a lot of work to do that you otherwise would not have to do. So those are my thoughts on it. I hope that's helpful to you. I think it's important as you decide on your asset allocation that you make sure it's something reasonable. And if you have some of these speculative investments that are hedging investments, don't have too many of them, number one. Don't put too much of your portfolio into them, number two. But at least put enough into it that it's going to do something if you believe in it and you really are going to put it in there. I'd say 5% is the amount to put in and go from there. If you want your questions answered by the White Coat Investor, record your question at whitecoatinvestor.com/YQA or click the link in the description.